The warm buzz of activity filled the airport terminal as passengers lined up for the late-night transatlantic flight. Bright lights reflected off polished floors, and the soft hum of announcements mixed with the chatter of travelers. Among them was Sarah Jenkins, a tall, poised black woman in her mid-30s. Her commanding presence and calm demeanor gave her an air of authority, though today she wore a simple, understated outfit, dark slacks, a crisp white blouse, and a sleek leather bag slung over her shoulder. She was a seasoned commercial pilot with over a decade of experience in the cockpit. But tonight, as she walked through the terminal blending in with the crowd, she didn't want to draw attention. It was her tradition to quietly observe passengers and the pre-boarding process before taking her place as captain of the flight. To her, it was a small but significant way to stay connected to the human element of her job. Sarah made her way to the gate, nodding politely to a few flight attendants as they smiled and greeted her. Her name was well known among the airline staff, and her reputation was stellar. She had worked her way up through sheer grit and competence, but she also knew the weight of being one of the few black women in her position. The responsibility to not only perform flawlessly, but also to constantly prove her worth came with the territory. Tonight's flight was no different. It was a full house, over 200 passengers, each with their own stories, destinations, and expectations. For Sarah, it was another night of ensuring they got there safely. Meanwhile, seated at the gate was Brad Carlson, a middle-aged, off-duty police officer in his mid-40s. He sat slouched in one of the uncomfortable airport chairs, scrolling irritably through his phone. His unkempt appearance, a wrinkled shirt, faded jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face suggested he had been traveling for hours and wasn't in the best of moods. Brad's sharp, hawkish eyes scanned the room, as if looking for trouble, a habit ingrained from years on the force. He didn't trust easily, especially in public spaces like this. To him, everyone was a potential threat, and his bias often guided his snap judgments. When Sarah passed by his row, Brad's eyes flickered to her, his gaze narrowing for just a moment. He didn't know her, but something about her presence irritated him. She walked with purpose, her posture straight, her expression calm yet focused. In Brad's world, people who carried themselves like that either had something to prove or something to hide. He muttered under his breath, brushing it off, but a seed of suspicion had already been planted in his mind. As the boarding process began, Sarah quietly observed passengers filing into the plane. Families with young children, business travelers, couples on vacation, all the usual mix. Her years of experience had taught her to spot potential troublemakers, but she saw none tonight. Still, she noted Brad as he made his way to his seat near the middle of the plane. His rigid demeanor and the way he scanned his surroundings made him stand out. She recognized the type of man used to authority, likely quick to assert himself in any situation. Sarah filed it away in her mind as a detail, nothing more. At least, not yet. Once the cabin was filled and passengers settled, Sarah decided to take a quick seat in one of the jump seats at the back of the plane. She often did this before takeoff, using the time to mentally prepare and observe the crew as they conducted safety checks. Tonight, she chose to wear civilian clothing instead of her uniform. It wasn't unusual. She preferred to avoid unnecessary attention during the initial boarding process, especially after a long day of preparation. Brad noticed her again as she moved to the back of the plane, this time without the anonymity of the crowded terminal. He frowned. She wasn't dressed like crew, and she wasn't sitting in a passenger seat. His mind started turning. Who is she, and why does she get special privileges? He thought. His irritation grew as he watched her exchange a few words with a flight attendant before taking her seat. From his perspective, it didn't add up. Why would someone like her be allowed in a restricted area? His instincts, already sharpened by years of law enforcement, convinced him there was something wrong. As the plane prepared for pushback, Brad leaned over to his seatmate and muttered, "That woman back there, doesn't she seem out of place to you?" Acting like she owns the place. The older man sitting next to him raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested, and mumbled something about not getting involved. Brad wasn't deterred. His sense of authority was ignited, and he decided to keep a close eye on Sarah throughout the flight. Meanwhile, Sarah checked her watch and stood, ready to head to the cockpit. She nodded to the flight attendants as she passed by, her movements efficient and confident. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like she was just another crew member assisting with boarding preparations, but those who knew her role understood her authority. Tonight, she was the captain of this flight, the final decision-maker responsible for the safety of everyone on board. Brad's eyes followed her as she made her way down the aisle. "Where does she think she's going now?" he muttered, his irritation bubbling into outright suspicion. To him, her movements weren't those of a crew member, they were calculated, almost sneaky. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his paranoia growing by the second. Just before Sarah reached the cockpit door, she paused to exchange a few words with her co-pilot, who had already taken his seat in the flight deck. Their conversation was brief but professional, a standard check-in before takeoff. From Brad's perspective, however, it looked like something far more sinister. Is she giving him instructions? Codes? He thought, his mind racing. He gripped the armrests of his seat, his breath quickening. Years of working as a cop had taught him to trust his gut, and right now, every instinct was telling him that something wasn't right. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Brad leaned forward in his seat, craning his neck to catch another glimpse of Sarah. She was now seated in the cockpit, her focus entirely on the controls and the checklist in front of her. For Brad, however, the sight only confirmed his suspicions. "No way," he whispered under his breath. "There's no way she's supposed to be in there." The stage was set. Sarah, calm and focused, prepared for the routine flight ahead, unaware of the storm brewing in the mind of the man seated just a few rows behind her. Brad, consumed by his biases and convinced he was witnessing something dangerous, prepared to take matters into his own hands. What began as a simple transatlantic flight was about to become a battleground for control, trust, and truth. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin as flight attendants began their routine. Passengers relaxed into their seats, some flipping through in-flight magazines, others scrolling through their devices or preparing to sleep. For most, it was an ordinary flight. But for Brad Carlson, the uneasy knot in his stomach refused to loosen. His gaze constantly flickered toward the cockpit door, his thoughts spiraling into imagined scenarios. The woman he had seen earlier, Sarah, was on his mind. Her movements, her interactions with the crew, and most of all, her presence in the cockpit, nagged at him. It just didn't sit right. He leaned forward in his seat, running through every possible explanation in his head. She didn't look like a pilot. And why wasn't she in uniform? Brad muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. His seatmate glanced at him briefly but didn't engage, sensing the tension radiating from the man. As the flight attendants moved through the aisle offering refreshments, Brad stopped one of them, a young woman with a polite, practiced smile. "Excuse me," he said, his tone sharp. "That woman who went into the cockpit earlier, who is she? She doesn't look like a pilot to me." The flight attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his abrupt question. "Oh, you mean Captain Jenkins? She's our captain for this flight," she said with a professional tone, her smile unwavering. Brad's eyes narrowed. "Captain, you're telling me she's flying this plane? I didn't see her in a uniform. How do I know she's even qualified?" The flight attendant's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "I assure you, sir, Captain Jenkins is one of our most experienced pilots. She has been with the airline for over a decade and has logged thousands of hours of flight time. You're in very capable hands." But Brad wasn't satisfied. In his mind, the flight attendant's answer only raised more questions. "Why wasn't she in uniform then?" he demanded. "Shouldn't a captain look the part? It's unprofessional, don't you think?" The flight attendant shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable with his persistence. "Sometimes our crew members choose to board in civilian attire for various reasons, but I can assure you that her credentials have been thoroughly verified. If you have any further concerns, I'd be happy to relay them to our senior staff." Brad waved her off, muttering, "No, I'll handle it myself." He watched as the flight attendant moved away, her polite smile now tinged with unease. Brad's paranoia deepened. To him, everything about Sarah seemed suspicious. Her lack of uniform, her calm demeanor, even the way she carried herself. It didn't fit the image of a pilot he had in his head. And if there was one thing Brad Carlson prided himself on, it was his instincts. Years of law enforcement had taught him to trust his gut, and right now it was screaming that something was wrong. As the hours passed, Brad's agitation grew. He couldn't let it go. The idea that someone he perceived as out of place could be in control of the flight gnawed at him. His thoughts spiraled further. What if she wasn't who she claimed to be? What if she was hiding something? What if she posed a danger to everyone on board? His mind conjured scenarios of hijackings, sabotage, or negligence. He had seen it all on the news, and in his line of work, he had learned to expect the worst. Finally, Brad decided he couldn't sit idly by. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. His large frame loomed as he made his way down the aisle, his movements purposeful and tense. He approached the front of the plane, stopping just short of the cockpit door, where a senior flight attendant stood. The attendant, a middle-aged man with years of experience handling difficult passengers, immediately noticed Brad's demeanor. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "I need to speak to the captain," Brad said bluntly. The attendant raised an eyebrow. "Is there an issue?" "The captain is currently engaged with flying the plane. If there's something you need, I'd be happy to assist." Brad crossed his arms, his posture exuding authority. "I don't think she's qualified to be up there. I don't know who let her on this plane, but I have serious doubts about her credentials. Someone needs to check this out before it's too late." The flight attendant's expression hardened slightly, though his tone remained professional. "Sir, I can assure you that Captain Jenkins is fully qualified and more than capable of flying this aircraft. She has undergone extensive training and holds all the necessary certifications." Brad wasn't having it. "You don't understand. I'm a former law enforcement officer, and I've seen situations like this before. People sneaking into places they don't belong, pretending to be something they're not. I need to speak to someone in charge." The flight attendant took a step closer, his voice dropping slightly in volume but gaining an edge. "Sir, I understand your concerns, but I must ask you to return to your seat. The cockpit is a restricted area, and unauthorized access is strictly prohibited." Brad bristled at the perceived dismissal. His voice rose. "I'm not just some passenger. I know when something's off. And I'm telling you, that woman is not supposed to be here. If you don't do something about it, I will." Several passengers nearby turned to look, their curiosity piqued by the escalating tension. The flight attendant remained calm but firm. "Sir, if you do not return to your seat, I will have no choice but to involve additional personnel. Please sit down and allow us to do our jobs." Brad's face flushed with anger. To him, this wasn't just about Sarah anymore, it was about being ignored, dismissed, and undermined. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with asserting his authority, and he wasn't about to back down. Without warning, Brad stepped closer to the cockpit door, his hand reaching for the handle. The flight attendant immediately blocked his path, his voice now sterner. "Sir, step back. This is your final warning." The commotion caught the attention of another flight attendant, who quickly approached to assist. Brad glanced around, realizing that the situation was drawing more eyes. His instincts told him to escalate further, to make his point clear. "If you don't let me in there, I'm going to call this in myself," he said, pulling out his phone. The senior attendant's expression shifted. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Sir, I strongly suggest you think carefully about your next move. Disrupting a flight crew is a federal offense. I assure you Captain Jenkins is more than capable of handling this flight. Now, please return to your seat." Brad hesitated for a moment, his grip tightening around his phone. He felt the weight of the passengers' stares, the flight attendant's unwavering stance, and the gravity of the situation he was creating. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his suspicions. He gave the attendants one final glare before turning and walking back to his seat, muttering under his breath, "This isn't over." As he sat down, his heart pounded with frustration and a sense of righteous indignation. He was convinced he was the only one seeing the truth, the only one willing to act. In his mind, he had just uncovered a potential disaster waiting to happen. What he didn't realize was that his actions had set in motion a chain of events that would test not only his assumptions, but also the very fabric of his understanding of authority, professionalism, and respect. As the plane continued its steady course across the Atlantic, the tension in Brad Carlson's mind reached a boiling point. Sitting rigidly in his seat, his thoughts churned relentlessly. To him, the dismissive attitude of the flight attendants only deepened his suspicions. They were covering for her Sarah Jenkins. There was no other explanation. This wasn't the first time Brad had encountered a situation where protocol was used to silence people like him. But this time the stakes were higher. Hundreds of lives were at risk, and he wasn't about to let bureaucratic procedures prevent him from doing what he believed was necessary. He glanced around the cabin, scanning the passengers. Most were either asleep or preoccupied with their screens, blissfully unaware of the supposed threat he was certain was unfolding in the cockpit. The idea that he might be the only one standing between these passengers and disaster filled him with both frustration and a grim sense of responsibility. He couldn't let it go. Not now. Not ever. Brad finally made up his mind. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and headed down the aisle toward the front of the plane once more. This time he wasn't going to ask questions or wait for permission. He was going to demand answers. When he reached the galley near the cockpit, the senior flight attendant, the same man who had confronted him earlier, was there, busily preparing refreshments for the crew. The attendant looked up and immediately recognized Brad's determined expression. He stepped forward to intercept him. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat," the flight attendant said, his voice firm but polite. "You've already expressed your concerns, and I've addressed them. There's no further need for discussion." Brad's jaw tightened. "I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation," he said, his voice low but tense. "That woman, your so-called captain, does not belong in the cockpit. I'm telling you, she's a danger to this flight." The flight attendant's patience was wearing thin. Sir, Captain Jenkins is a highly experienced pilot. She's logged thousands of hours and is fully qualified to fly this aircraft. Your concerns are unfounded. Now, please return to your seat before this becomes a larger issue. But Brad wasn't backing down. He stepped closer, his voice rising. Do you even know who she really is? Have you checked her credentials? Or are you just taking her word for it? Because I'm not willing to gamble my life or anyone else's on your blind faith. The flight attendant took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. Sir, I understand that you may have concerns, but your behavior is becoming disruptive. If you continue to interfere with the crew's duties, I will have no choice but to report this incident to the authorities upon landing. Brad's face reddened. You think I'm being disruptive? I'm trying to save this flight, and you're too blind to see the truth. If you won't do your job, then I'll do it for you. With that, Brad pushed past the flight attendant and marched toward the cockpit door. The attendant immediately stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Sir, stop right there, the attendant said, his voice now commanding. This is your final warning. Any further attempt to breach the cockpit will be treated as a serious security violation. But Brad was past the point of reasoning. His mind was locked in on his mission, and he refused to be deterred. Step aside, he growled, his hand reaching out to shove the attendant out of the way. The attendant held his ground, but the commotion had drawn the attention of another crew member, a younger flight attendant, who quickly approached. What's going on here? She asked, her eyes darting between Brad and her colleague. This passenger is attempting to interfere with the cockpit, the senior attendant explained. He refuses to comply with instructions and is escalating the situation. Brad turned to the younger attendant, hoping to find a more sympathetic ear. Listen to me, he said, his voice laced with urgency. That woman in the cockpit is not who she says she is. She's not qualified to fly this plane. You need to let me in there before it's too late. The younger attendant glanced at her colleague, then back at Brad. Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down and return to your seat, she said, her tone steady but firm. The captain is fully capable of flying this aircraft. There is no danger. But Brad wasn't listening. His paranoia had consumed him entirely. You're all complicit in this, he snapped. You're covering for her. Why? Is it because you're afraid of being called out? Afraid of the backlash? Well, I'm not afraid, and I'm not going to let this go. At this point, several passengers had turned their attention to the scene unfolding near the front of the plane. Murmurs of confusion and concern rippled through the cabin as people craned their necks to get a better look. The tension was palpable, and the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment. Sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control, the senior attendant made a decision. He reached for the intercom and pressed the button to contact the cockpit. Captain Jenkins, he said, his voice calm but urgent. We have a situation in the cabin that requires your attention. A moment later, the cockpit door opened, and Sarah Jenkins stepped out. She was now wearing her captain's jacket, her epaulets and nameplate clearly visible. Her expression was calm and composed, but there was a steely determination in her eyes. What seems to be the problem? Sarah asked, her gaze shifting between the flight attendants and Brad. Brad's eyes widened as he took in the sight of her in uniform. For a brief moment he faltered, but his resolve quickly returned. You, he said, pointing at her. You're the problem. You're not fit to be flying this plane. I've been watching you, and I know something's not right. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. Sir, I assure you that I am fully qualified and capable of operating this aircraft. If you have concerns, I'm happy to address them. But interfering with the crew and attempting to breach the cockpit is a serious offense. Brad took a step closer, his voice rising. "Don't try to lecture me. I've dealt with people like you before, people who think they can fake their way into positions of authority. But I see through you. You're a fraud." The flight attendants moved to position themselves between Brad and Sarah, ready to intervene if necessary. But Sarah held up a hand, signaling them to stay back. She took a step forward, her gaze locking onto Brad's. "Sir," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I understand that you may have concerns, but your actions are endangering the safety of this flight. I need you to return to your seat immediately." Brad shook his head, his fists clenched. "No, I'm not going anywhere until I know the truth. If you're really the captain, prove it. Show me your credentials." Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and calmly produced her ID badge, holding it up for Brad to see. Her name, photo, and credentials were clearly displayed. "This is my identification," she said. "I am Captain Sarah Jenkins, and I am in command of this aircraft. Now, please return to your seat before this escalates further." But Brad wasn't convinced. In his mind, the badge could be fake, a carefully crafted prop designed to deceive. "I don't believe you," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "You're lying. You're putting all of us at risk, and I won't stand for it." Sarah's expression hardened. "Sir, I'm giving you one final warning. Return to your seat, or I will have no choice but to take further action." Brad's face contorted with rage. "You think you can intimidate me? I know what's going on here. You're hiding something, and I'm going to expose it." With that, Brad lunged forward, his hand reaching out as if to grab Sarah's badge. The flight attendants reacted instantly, stepping in to restrain him. A brief struggle ensued, during which Brad shouted accusations and warnings, his voice echoing through the cabin. Sarah remained calm, stepping back to give the crew room to handle the situation. Her mind was focused on maintaining control and ensuring the safety of everyone on board. But as she watched Brad being subdued, she couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. This was supposed to be a routine flight, yet here she was, dealing with a man whose prejudices and paranoia had turned him into a threat. The flight attendants managed to restrain Brad and escorted him back to his seat, where they firmly instructed him to stay put. One of them remained nearby to monitor him, while another contacted the authorities on the ground to report the incident. Sarah returned to the cockpit, her composure intact but her mind racing. She knew this wasn't over. Brad's outburst was just the beginning, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. The plane flew steadily through the night sky, a beacon of light cutting through the darkness. Inside the cabin, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The tension was palpable. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, throwing wary glances toward Brad Carlson, who sat rigidly in his seat near the middle of the plane, his fists clenched tightly on the armrests. His earlier confrontation with Captain Sarah Jenkins had created a ripple effect. People were uneasy, unsure of what to make of the situation. Brad, for his part, was seething. He replayed the encounter in his mind over and over again. Sarah's calm demeanor, her measured tone, it all felt like a performance to him, a facade hiding something sinister. Her credentials had meant nothing to him. In fact, they only deepened his suspicions. To Brad, everything about her screamed deception. His gut told him she wasn't who she claimed to be, and years of trusting that gut had convinced him that he was the only one who could see the truth. Everyone else, the flight attendants, the passengers, even the co-pilot, had been fooled, but not him. The flight attendants, having warned Brad to remain in his seat, were now on high alert. They rotated their positions to keep a discreet eye on him, worried he might escalate again. One of them, the senior attendant, quietly informed the co-pilot via intercom about Brad's behavior and the need for an official report upon landing. The co-pilot assured him that the cockpit was secure and that Captain Jenkins was handling the flight without issue. But everyone knew the situation was fragile, a thin thread holding it all together. Sarah Jenkins sat in the cockpit, her hands steady on the controls. Externally, she was the picture of professionalism. But inside, her mind was racing. She'd encountered difficult passengers before, but this was different. Brad's accusations weren't just baseless, they were personal. She could feel the weight of his prejudice in every word he'd spoken, every glare he'd thrown her way. It wasn't just about her role as a pilot, it was about her identity as a black woman in a position of authority. He didn't see her qualifications, her experience, or her capabilities. He only saw what his bias allowed him to see. Her co-pilot, Mark, glanced at her from his seat. "You okay, Captain?" he asked, his voice low and calm. Sarah nodded. "I'm fine," she replied, though her tone betrayed a hint of frustration. "Just focused on the flight." Mark hesitated before speaking again. "You handled that well back there. Most people wouldn't have kept their cool." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "It's part of the job. You don't let turbulence throw you off course." Mark chuckled softly. "I'll remind you of that next time I'm dealing with an unruly passenger." Sarah appreciated his attempt to lighten the mood, but her mind remained on Brad. She knew his type men who couldn't handle being challenged, especially by someone like her. He wasn't going to let this go, and she had to be prepared for whatever came next. Back in the cabin, Brad's anger festered. He stared at the seat in front of him, his jaw tight, his thoughts a storm of indignation and paranoia. He couldn't understand why no one else saw what he did. How could they be so blind? How could they trust her so easily? His frustration turned into an annoying sense of duty. If no one else would act, he had to. He couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Brad pulled out his phone and began typing furiously, drafting a message he intended to send as soon as the plane landed. It was addressed to a contact in law enforcement, someone he trusted to take his concerns seriously. The message was filled with accusations about Sarah, her suspicious behavior, and the airline's failure to properly vet their staff. He included every detail he could think of, painting himself as the lone voice of reason in a sea of complacency. As he typed, a flight attendant approached his row, her polite smile masking the tension she felt. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice calm, "is everything all right? Can I get you something to drink?" Brad didn't look up. "I'm fine," he snapped, his tone curt. The flight attendant lingered for a moment, unsure if she should press further. Ultimately, she decided to leave him be, returning to the galley to report his behavior to her colleagues. "He's still agitated," she told the senior attendant. "I don't think he's calming down anytime soon." The senior attendant frowned. "Keep an eye on him, but don't engage unless necessary. We just need to get through the rest of this flight without any more incidents." But Brad had no intention of letting the flight pass quietly. He was determined to confront Sarah again, this time with more force. He needed to prove to everyone, especially her, that he was right, that she didn't belong here. As the hours passed, the cabin settled into a tense quiet. Most passengers were asleep or lost in their own worlds, but Brad remained wide awake, his mind racing. Finally, he made his move. He stood abruptly, drawing the attention of the flight attendants. They watched warily as he made his way toward the front of the plane once more. This time, he didn't stop at the galley. He marched straight to the cockpit door and banged on it with his fist. The sound echoed through the cabin, jolting several passengers awake. Gasps and murmurs spread as people realized what was happening. The senior flight attendant was on him in seconds, stepping between Brad and the cockpit door. "Sir, step back immediately," he said, his voice firm and authoritative. You are violating federal aviation regulations." Brad ignored him, his focus solely on the door. "Open up," he shouted, pounding on the door again. "I need to speak to the captain. This is an emergency." The commotion caused the co-pilot to glance at Sarah in alarm. "Captain, we've got a situation out there," he said, his hand hovering over the intercom. Sarah's expression hardened. "Stay here," she said. "I'll handle it." She unbuckled her harness and stood, her movements calm but deliberate. When she opened the cockpit door, the sight of Brad standing there, his face red with anger, confirmed what she already knew. He wasn't going to stop. "Sir, you need to return to your seat," Sarah said, her voice steady but firm. "This behavior is unacceptable and jeopardizes the safety of this flight." Brad stepped closer, his voice a low growl. "You think you can shut me up with your credentials and your fake professionalism? I know what's going on here. You're not fooling me." Sarah didn't flinch. She held his gaze, her expression unyielding. "What's going on here," she said, "is that you're creating a disturbance and endangering everyone on this plane. I need you to sit down and stop interfering, or I will be forced to take action." Brad laughed bitterly. "Take action? You don't have the authority. You shouldn't even be here. People like you." He stopped himself, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "People like me," she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Brad hesitated, but his anger overpowered his caution. "You don't belong here," he said. "You don't have what it takes to do this job. I see right through you." The flight attendants stepped in, positioning themselves between Sarah and Brad. One of them spoke firmly. "Sir, this is your final warning. Return to your seat now, or we will restrain you." Brad glared at them, his chest heaving with frustration. He looked back at Sarah, searching for any sign of weakness. But there was none. She stood tall, her composure unshaken, her authority undeniable. Realizing he was outnumbered, Brad finally stepped back, though his glare never left Sarah. "This isn't over," he muttered as he returned to his seat. Sarah watched him go, her jaw tight. She took a deep breath before turning to the flight attendants. "Monitor him closely," she said, "and inform the authorities on the ground. We're going to need security waiting for him when we land." As she returned to the cockpit, Sarah couldn't shake the weight of the encounter. She knew Brad's actions weren't just about her role as a captain. They were about his inability to accept her authority, her competence, her presence. And while she had faced prejudice before, something about this confrontation felt different, more dangerous. She sat back in her seat, her hands steady on the controls, her mind focused on the flight ahead. But deep down, she knew the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The tension in the cabin was thick, an invisible weight pressing down on the passengers and crew. For most, the uneasy quiet was a welcome reprieve after Brad Carlson's early outburst. But for the flight crew, the silence was deceptive, an ominous calm before the inevitable storm. Brad's glare from his seat near the middle of the plane was unrelenting, his chest heaving as he tried to suppress his frustration. His earlier confrontation with Captain Sarah Jenkins had done nothing to assuage his suspicions. Instead, it had ignited a fire in him, one that burned hotter with every passing minute. In the cockpit, Sarah sat composed, her eyes fixed on the horizon and her hands steady on the controls. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was working overtime. Brad's behavior was erratic, fueled by paranoia and prejudice, and she knew it wasn't over. She glanced at her co-pilot, Mark, whose furrowed brow betrayed his own concerns. "Think he'll try again?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. Sarah sighed, her voice calm but firm. "People like him don't back down easily. He's convinced he's right, and that makes him unpredictable. We need to stay focused and make sure we land safely." Mark nodded, his respect for Sarah growing. Despite the intensity of the situation, she exuded a quiet authority that steadied the nerves of everyone around her. He had flown with her before and knew she was one of the best, not just because of her skill but because of her ability to handle pressure with unshakable composure. Back in the cabin, Brad was far from composed. His thoughts spiraled, feeding off his growing resentment. To him, Sarah wasn't just a danger, she was a challenge to his authority, his worldview, his sense of order. How could someone like her hold such a position of power? He couldn't let it stand. His mind raced with ways to prove his suspicions, to expose her for the fraud he was certain she was. He scanned the cabin, his sharp eyes darting from one passenger to another. Most had returned to their routines, reading, sleeping, watching in-flight entertainment, but a few still glanced his way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Brad ignored them. He wasn't here to win a popularity contest. He was here to protect these people, whether they appreciated it or not. Suddenly, Brad's eyes landed on a young man seated a few rows ahead of him. The man, who appeared to be in his early 20s, was fidgeting nervously with his backpack, his eyes darting around the cabin. To Brad, he looked suspicious, out of place. His law enforcement instincts kicked in, and his paranoia found a new target. "Hey," Brad hissed, leaning toward the man. The young passenger froze, looking up at Brad with wide eyes. "What's in the bag?" Brad demanded, his voice low but intense. The man blinked, confused. Just my stuff. Clothes, books, that kind of thing." Brad narrowed his eyes. "Open it. Let me see." The young man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Why? What's wrong?" Brad leaned closer, his tone menacing. "You're acting nervous. Makes me think you've got something to hide. Open the bag, or I'll get the flight attendants involved." The commotion drew the attention of nearby passengers, who began whispering amongst themselves. A middle-aged woman across the aisle spoke up, her voice sharp. "Leave him alone. He's not doing anything wrong." Brad turned his glare on her. "Stay out of this," he snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." The young man clutched his backpack tighter, his face pale. "I'm not hiding anything," he stammered. "Please, just leave me alone." At that moment, one of the flight attendants appeared, alerted by the raised voices. It was the senior attendant, whose patience with Brad had long since worn thin. "Sir, what's going on?" he asked, his tone firm. Brad pointed at the young man. "This guy's acting suspicious. I think he might have something dangerous in that bag." The flight attendant frowned, glancing at the terrified passenger. "Sir, unless you have evidence to support that claim, I need you to stop harassing other passengers and return to your seat." Brad bristled, his face flushing with anger. "You don't understand. I'm trying to protect this flight, and you're too blind to see the threats right in front of you." The flight attendant stepped closer, lowering his voice but maintaining a firm tone. "What I understand, sir, is that you're causing a disturbance and making other passengers uncomfortable. If this behavior continues, we will be forced to restrain you." The word restrain hung in the air, a sharp reminder of just how serious the situation had become. Brad's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he might back down. But then his eyes flicked toward the cockpit, and his resolve hardened. He wasn't done yet. Brad stood abruptly, shoving past the flight attendant and storming toward the front of the plane. Gasps erupted from the passengers, and several craned their necks to watch the unfolding drama. The flight attendant immediately followed, signaling to his colleagues for assistance. "Sir, stop right now." The attendant called after him. "This is your final warning." Brad ignored him, his focus solely on the cockpit door. He reached it in seconds, pounding on it with his fist. "Open up," he shouted. "I need to speak to the captain." Inside the cockpit, Sarah and Mark exchanged a tense glance. The pounding on the door was loud, insistent, and accompanied by Brad's angry shouts. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'll handle it," she said, standing and moving toward the door. "Be careful," Mark cautioned, his concern evident. Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. She opened the door just enough to step out, closing it firmly behind her. The sight of Brad's flushed, furious face greeted her. "Sir, you need to stop this immediately," Sarah said, her voice calm but authoritative. "You are jeopardizing the safety of this flight." Brad took a step closer, his towering frame attempting to intimidate her. "I'm not the one jeopardizing anything," he spat. "You are. You don't belong in that cockpit, and I'm not going to sit here and let you put everyone at risk." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What exactly do you think you're accomplishing by this? You've made baseless accusations, disrupted the crew, and frightened the passengers. This behavior is unacceptable." Brad jabbed a finger toward her. "Don't try to turn this around on me. I've seen people like you before pretending to be something you're not. But I see through it. You don't have what it takes to be in charge of this plane." Sarah's expression hardened, her patience thinning. "People like me," she repeated, her voice low and cold. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Brad hesitated, but his anger pushed him forward. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and conviction. "You're not capable. You're a danger to everyone on board." The senior flight attendant stepped forward, placing a hand on Brad's arm. "That's enough, sir. Return to your seat immediately." Brad shook off the attendant's hand, his glare fixed on Sarah. "You're all complicit in this," he growled. "You're protecting her because you're too scared to admit the truth." Sarah took a step closer, her voice steady and commanding. "Sir, let me make this perfectly clear. I am the captain of this aircraft, and I have full authority over this flight. If you do not comply with the crew's instructions, you will be restrained, and you will face severe consequences upon landing. This is not a debate. This is your final warning." Brad's fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with barely contained rage. For a moment it seemed like he might lash out. But then the weight of the situation, the flight attendants surrounding him, the passengers watching, the undeniable authority in Sarah's voice seemed to sink in. With a final glare, Brad turned and stormed back to his seat, muttering under his breath. The flight attendants exchanged relieved glances, though their vigilance didn't waver. Sarah returned to the cockpit, her composure unshaken, but her mind racing. She knew this wasn't the end. Brad Carlson was a man determined to assert his full sense of superiority, and he wouldn't stop until he was forced to, and she was ready for it. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight settled into the final hours of its journey. Most passengers had fallen asleep, cocooned under airline blankets, their earbuds drowning out the hum of the engines. But not Brad Carlson. His mind was a storm of indignation and unyielding determination. Sitting stiffly in his seat, he glared at the cockpit door as if sheer willpower could force it open. He had been humiliated, dismissed by the crew, ignored by the captain, and even judged by the other passengers. But in Brad's mind, they were all wrong, blind to the threat that Sarah Jenkins represented. Brad had reached his breaking point. He decided that if no one would take his concerns seriously, he would take matters into his own hands. He clenched his fists, the veins in his forearms bulging as he devised his next move. It wasn't just about proving he was right anymore, it was about taking back control. A flight attendant, noticing Brad's rigid posture and darting eyes, approached cautiously. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, keeping her tone calm and professional. Brad barely looked at her. "I'm fine," he snapped. The attendant hesitated. "If there's anything you need." "I said I'm fine," Brad growled, his voice cutting through the low hum of the cabin. The flight attendant stiffened and walked away, casting a concerned glance toward her colleagues in the galley. The senior attendant nodded subtly, understanding the unspoken warning, "Keep an eye on him." Brad waited until the flight attendants moved to another section of the cabin. Then, with a swift, calculated motion, he stood and strode toward the cockpit. His towering frame and determined gait immediately drew the attention of a few passengers who had been quietly watching him. Whispered murmurs rippled through the cabin as Brad reached the galley and turned toward the cockpit door. This time he didn't knock. Instead, he grabbed the handle and attempted to open the door. It was locked. Of course, standard protocol during flight, but Brad wasn't deterred. He pounded on the door with his fist, his voice booming. "Open the door. This is an emergency." Inside the cockpit, Sarah Jenkins and her co-pilot, Mark, exchanged a tense glance. The pounding on the door was loud, insistent, and unmistakable. Sarah sighed, her hands steady on the controls. "He's at it again." Mark frowned. "He's escalating. Do you want me to?" "I'll handle it," Sarah said, unbuckling her harness. She straightened her jacket and moved toward the door, her expression calm but firm. "Stay here and monitor the instruments." Mark nodded, though his brow furrowed with concern. "Be careful, Captain." Sarah stepped out of the cockpit, closing the door securely behind her. She was immediately met with Brad's enraged face, his fists clenched at his sides. Behind him, a small crowd of passengers had begun to gather, their murmurs growing louder. "Sir," Sarah said, her voice steady and authoritative, "you need to stop this immediately. Your actions are endangering the safety of this flight." Brad took a step closer, his large frame towering over her. "Don't give me that. You're the one endangering this flight. I know you're not who you say you are. You're a fraud, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "I am the captain of this aircraft, and I have full authority over this flight. Your behavior is not only disruptive but also a federal offense. This is your final warning. Return to your seat now." But Brad wasn't listening. His voice rose, his words spilling out in a torrent of anger and paranoia. "You think you can scare me with your authority? I've dealt with people like you before, people who think they can just waltz into positions they don't deserve. Well, I'm not falling for it. I've seen through your act from the beginning." The murmurs from the gathered passengers grew louder, a mix of disbelief and outrage. One man near the front stepped forward, his voice firm. "Hey, buddy, that's enough. You're out of line." Brad whipped around, his glare silencing the man. "Stay out of this," he snarled. "This isn't about you." The senior flight attendant approached, his expression resolute. "Sir, step away from the cockpit door immediately, or we will have no choice but to restrain you." Brad's head snapped back towards Sarah, his voice dripping with disdain. "Restrain me? For what?" "For protecting this flight from someone who shouldn't even be here." Sarah held his gaze, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Sir, your actions are jeopardizing the safety of everyone on board. This is your final warning. Return to your seat." But Brad didn't move. Instead, he lunged towards Sarah, his hand reaching out as if to grab her shoulder. The move was quick, aggressive, and it was the breaking point. Before Brad could make contact, the senior flight attendant and another crew member grabbed him, pulling him back with practiced precision. Brad struggled, his voice rising into a shout. "Let go of me. She's the one putting us all in danger. You're all blind." The flight attendants wrestled him into a hold, their movements efficient but forceful. One of them reached for the restraint kit, a standard issue for dealing with unruly passengers. Within moments, Brad's wrists were bound with plastic cuffs, his arms pinned behind him. The gathered passengers erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Sarah raised a hand, her voice cutting through the noise. "Everyone, please remain calm and return to your seats. The situation is under control." Brad continued to shout, his voice echoing through the cabin. "You're making a mistake. She's a fraud. You're all in danger." Sarah turned to the senior flight attendant. "Keep him restrained and monitored until we land. Notify the authorities on the ground that we'll need security to meet the aircraft." The attendant nodded. "Understood, Captain." As the flight attendants escorted Brad to a rear section of the plane, away from the other passengers, Sarah addressed the crowd once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the crew. We will be landing shortly." The murmurs subsided as passengers returned to their seats, though the tension lingered in the air. Sarah took a deep breath and returned to the cockpit. She sat down, her hands steady on the controls, but her mind was racing. "Everything okay out there?" Mark asked, his tone cautious. "For now," Sarah replied, her voice measured. "He's restrained, and the crew is handling him. But this isn't over. We'll need to file a full report when we land." Mark nodded, his respect for Sarah evident in his expression. "You handled that like a pro." Sarah allowed herself a brief smile, though the weight of the situation still hung heavy on her shoulders. "It's part of the job," she said. But deep down, she knew this was more than just a routine incident. Brad's actions weren't just about his suspicions, they were a direct challenge to her authority, her competence, and her identity. And while she had faced prejudice before, this confrontation had taken it to a new level. As the plane began its descent, Sarah focused on the task at hand. She guided the aircraft with precision, her mind clear and her resolve unwavering. Whatever waited for her on the ground, whether it was Brad's continued accusations or the fallout from his actions, she was ready to face it head on. She had spent her entire career proving that she belonged in the cockpit, and tonight was no different. For Sarah Jenkins, this was more than just a flight. It was a testament to her strength, her professionalism, and her refusal to let anyone, not even someone like Brad Carlson, dictate her worth. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the gentle bump of the landing gear signaling the end of a tense and turbulent flight. A sigh of relief rippled through the cabin, passengers leaning back into their seats, grateful to be on solid ground. But for Sarah Jenkins, the flight wasn't over, not yet. She brought the aircraft to a controlled taxi toward the gate, her hands steady on the controls as her mind remained focused. In her years as a pilot, she had faced her share of challenges in the air, but this one was different. This wasn't about mechanical issues or weather delays, this was personal. "Welcome to New York," Mark announced over the intercom, his voice calm and professional. "We ask that you remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate. On behalf of Captain Jenkins and the entire crew, thank you for flying with us." Sarah glanced at him, appreciating his steady demeanor throughout the ordeal. He met her eyes and gave her a small nod of encouragement. She knew they had both felt the weight of the situation, but now it was time to face the aftermath. As the plane taxied to the gate, the senior flight attendant entered the cockpit. His expression was serious but composed. "The authorities are waiting at the gate, Captain," he informed her. "They've been fully briefed on the situation. Brad Carlson is still restrained, and he hasn't calmed down." Sarah nodded, her voice measured. "Thank you. Make sure the passengers are disembarked safely before the authorities take him off the plane. I'll file a report once everyone is clear." The attendant hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Captain, I just wanted to say the way you handled everything, it was incredible. The crew and we all saw what you were dealing with. You have our respect." Sarah offered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you. Let's make sure we finish this flight as professionally as it began." The plane came to a stop at the gate, and the soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off signaled the passengers that it was time to disembark. Flight attendants moved swiftly through the cabin, ensuring the process was smooth and orderly. But the tension lingered in the air, a reminder of the drama that had unfolded at 30,000 feet. Brad Carlson sat in the rear of the plane, his hands bound in plastic cuffs, his face flushed with anger and frustration. Two airport security officers boarded the aircraft, their expressions calm but authoritative. As they approached, Brad straightened in his seat, his defiance still burning in his eyes. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "You're arresting the wrong person. She's the one you should be questioning, not me." The officers ignored his protests, moving efficiently to escort him off the plane. Passengers craned their necks to watch the scene unfold, some whispering to each other, others recording discreetly with their phones. Brad's voice echoed through the cabin as he was led away. "This isn't over," he shouted, his tone a mix of anger and desperation. "You'll see. She's a fraud, and I'll prove it." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, but the flight attendants maintained their professionalism, guiding the remaining passengers off the plane with calm efficiency. Sarah stayed in the cockpit, her expression unreadable as she waited for the last passenger to disembark. When the cabin was finally empty, Sarah stepped out of the cockpit, her presence commanding but calm. The senior flight attendant approached her. "The cabin is clear, Captain. The authorities have Carlson in custody. I've documented everything for the report." "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice steady. "You and the crew handled yourselves incredibly well. I couldn't have asked for better support." The attendant nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "If you need anything, Captain, just let us know." Sarah made her way off the plane, stepping into the terminal where airport security and airline management were waiting. The security officers had Brad Carlson seated nearby, his hands still restrained. He glared at her as she approached, his expression twisted with contempt. One of the airline managers, a middle-aged woman with a professional demeanor, stepped forward to greet Sarah. "Captain Jenkins, we've been fully briefed on the situation. Security has taken Mr. Carlson into custody and will be conducting a full investigation." Sarah nodded, her tone measured. "Thank you. I'll provide my report as soon as I've debriefed with the crew. I appreciate the swift response." As the conversation continued, Brad interrupted, his voice loud and accusatory. "This is a mistake. She's not who she says she is. She's dangerous, and you're all too blind to see it." The manager turned to Brad, her expression firm. "Mr. Carlson, you've already been warned multiple times. Your behavior on this flight was unacceptable and a violation of federal regulations. You'll have the opportunity to explain your actions to the proper authorities." Brad's face turned red with anger, but he fell silent, his protests now reduced to muttered curses. Sarah met his gaze briefly, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't need to say anything, her silence spoke volumes. For Brad, it was a dismissal and acknowledgement that his actions, his accusations, his very presence held no power over her. After providing her report to the airline management and security team, Sarah finally stepped away, heading toward the crew lounge. The adrenaline of the flight was wearing off, and the weight of the ordeal began to settle on her shoulders. But even as she felt the exhaustion creeping in, she held her head high. She had faced prejudice, hostility, and open defiance, and she had risen above it. In the crew lounge, Sarah sat down and let out a slow breath. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages from friends and family. One message stood out. It was from her younger sister, a simple text that read, "Proud of you, Captain." Sarah smiled, the tension in her chest easing slightly. She typed a quick reply, "Thanks. Long flight, but we made it." As she sat there, a flight attendant from her crew approached, a cup of coffee in hand. "Captain Jenkins," he said, offering her the cup. "Thought you might need this." Sarah accepted it with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you. You did a great job tonight." The attendant smiled. "You inspire us, Captain? Just wanted you to know that." Sarah took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through her as she reflected on his words. She didn't seek to be an inspiration. She simply wanted to do her job, to be recognized for her skill and professionalism like anyone else. But if her actions tonight had shown even one person the strength of grace under pressure, then it was worth it. As she prepared to leave the lounge and head home, Sarah paused for a moment, looking out at the bustling terminal beyond the windows. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be people like Brad Carlson, ready to question her authority, her competence, her very right to exist in her role. But she also knew that she was ready for them. She had proven herself time and again, not just to others, but to herself. And as she walked out of the lounge, head held high, she knew one thing for certain: she belonged.